Thank you so much for that introduction, and I'm so excited for this panel. So many heavy hitters here. Welcome to our participants and guests. Thank you for coming. So as Ziv said, I've been looking at the problem of disinformation for just over 5 years. First a reporter and now as a researcher. And a lot has changed in that time. If in 2016, the questions that worried us were what is online disinformation and how does it work? How do we dissect it? And what is its impact? Today, its impact is pretty undeniable. We've collectively witnessed how networked hate and harassment have undermined our institutions, and not just the US, but globally as well. Harassment and false information and hyperpartisanship have wreaked havoc around the world. And so today, the question is not what are these issues and how do they work? The question is how do we reduce societal harms that they cause? And the reason why we talk about reducing harms and not eliminating them is because it's a very tricky problem and there won't be a silver bullet. The companies hosting the harmful content and profiting from it boast billions of users worldwide. And they frequently fall down on issues of moderation, especially in non-English speaking communities. Regulators worldwide are looking at the delicate dance of addressing the problem without stifling speech. And meanwhile, disinformation, hate speech, and polarization, actively hurt our citizens and our democracies. So harmful information on social media is a multifaceted problem, and it's going to require equally multifaceted solutions. So that's what we'll get into today. The run of show is I'll introduce each of our panelists and give them a few minutes to talk a little bit about their work. Then we'll have a discussion and time for questions near the end. So if you have questions, please use the Q&A function on Zoom, and I will pose them to our panelists. So the first person I'd like to bring in is Niousha Roshani, who's the Deputy Director of the Content Policy and Society Lab and a fellow of the Program on Democracy and Internet at Stanford University. She's a multi-sectoral social scientist, innovator, and global connector at the nexus of technology, business, and human rights. She has experience in research, policy, and practice working in more than 25 countries in directing organizations and programs, establishing strategic partnerships, and working with entrepreneurs, philanthropy, and the private and public sectors. Niousha, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dane. It's really a great honor to be sharing the floor with really fantastic people today. I'm connecting from Brazil, so I'm happy to also bring a lot of the Brazilian reality to the conversation today. And as Jane said, since the creation of the first content platforms, our main concern initially was how do we find more users, right? How do we increase more and more users? But then as this information basically expanded exponentially, it has become really urgent for industries, but not just industries, right? Governments, civil society has been trying to address this, academics have been trying to write about this, to think about the most efficient ways to ensure that their content was safe and accurate, as well as their products, not just content. So today, these platforms circulate and share massive amounts of and verified information, which can spark or fuel violent uprisings and conflicts, like we currently see in Ethiopia, and we've seen in other parts of the world. We can lead to the spread of deadly viruses, infections, impacting social stability in many countries, affecting really millions of lives. One thing that I really like to focus on and discuss is that while we have a lot of the discussions and discourses and policies and initiatives really center in the US and Europe, the large majority of the users are actually in other parts outside of the US and Europe, which we often call it the global South, but as my co-founder Judy likes to call it, the global majority. The global audience is really fixated on the impact of social media on Western democracies, largely leaving out the global majority. The impact is felt in conflict areas and regions where companies had the largest number of users and platform engagement. But yet there's completely almost, a concern on accountability or initiative on accountability is almost zero. This underinvestment of companies and impact the tech causes increases both costs for the companies and even the US governments. So looking at, especially over here in light of the election, the Brazilian elections next year, then as Jane said, it creates a lot of polarized communities. People are really scared about what's going to happen next year, their safety. And so I'm really in the midst of a lot of this conversation, but a lot of this conversation is very much remains in Brazil, and very little of it, and not just in Brazil, in other parts of the world as well, very little of it leaves Brazil, and this expertise leaves Brazil to inform, for example, the way that we do things in Washington, D.C. or in the Silicon Valley. So really looking beyond issues of and discussions related to leaving up or taking down content online, we have a strong focus in that, are really those related to content policy that starts at content or product creation to process to the rules put in place to regulate that content. But many of these policies are thought, designed, and implemented by each sector in regional silos and in isolation to each other. We keep on asking ourselves how to mitigate the harms of disruptive technologies and platforms as we come up with more and more with innovation, how to ensure that we think about all the components, intersectionalities, the realities, the context, languages, the cultural factors, and basically the diversity of these factors and realities reflected online. But yet we are not ready to decentralize the decisions, the design of our products, and the policies to include the diversity and knowledge of these perspectives of the most affected people and communities by our innovation and disruptive technologies. So with that in mind, we created the content policy and society lab at Stanford University, really looking at identifying solutions to the main challenges of moderating content online while respecting fundamental human rights. And that's like very much a topic du jour. We don't have the answers, but we're prototyping a model for like a multi-stakeholder model that takes into account the knowledge and expertise of governments, of civil society, of private companies, and then trying to identify and implement solutions to the main challenges, right? So we use a very much a proactive and contextualized approach. We have experts and knowledge producers everywhere in the world, right? So we're setting up international knowledge hubs to really try to decentralize that decision-making from Silicon Valley, from DC, and then to really include those perspectives and what's really happening. So they see the relevance of these policies impacting their lives, and then to make the knowledge as horizontal as possible. Since the launch of the lab in September, we have hosted a series of workshops and public briefings. The first workshop looked at content moderation of dangerous organizations, really responding to everything that was happening in the media, but also in the recent events in Afghanistan, and think about, what is our role and what do we have to do, considering that these companies are operating globally, but yet they're abiding by US laws, right? So how is it that we position ourselves, we think these laws, but then how is it that those laws impact people in Afghanistan or Nigeria or other parts of the world? And then what do we mean by dangerous organizations? How is it that we are in lists or an organization on the terrorist list or, different kind of lists? It's very confusing, and yet there's very little information and kind of knowledge sharing between the different stakeholders. One of the participants we had in our roundtable discussion, that workshop, was from the Nigerian government. And it was only then that we found out that when the president's post was taken out by Twitter, it was done so by automated regulation. So it wasn't a content moderator with a knowledge of the context in Nigeria, thinking and understanding what that post is about. It was just taken down, but it caused a lot of turmoil. It put a lot of people's safety, especially the activists, at risk. They're not able to really voice out their concerns about everything that was happening. So it was something that could have been mitigated, that could have been avoided, but yet it created a lot of issues. The second workshop that we had was looking at content moderations beyond social media platforms. We're very rarely thinking about, we had content, like for example, platforms like Dropbox or Shopify or GitHub, like how is it that they look at harmful content, or how is it that they deal with it? What are their policies in play? And really discussing and sharing that knowledge. It was a very dynamic conversation. We will have our next workshop in February looking at the approaches of civil society to harmful content online. What is it that they've been doing? And we have representative from Indonesia, Brazil, and South Sudan. And then we'll have, follow up by the perspective approaches of governments, and really thinking about bringing together India, Brazil, and France, looking at the elections next year. It's going to be a very dynamic conversation. We also had a public briefing bringing together Ethiopian activists and experts to discuss what is happening in Ethiopia. We have a very misconstrued knowledge of what's happening in Ethiopia. There's a misinformation that's been disseminated by Western news media that caused a lot of issues that really fueled the conflict in Ethiopia. But nothing has been done about it, right? So we have a very limited knowledge. And then we put together experts from the US. Yes, they have expertise, but they'll never have that much expertise as those, located, those situated in in Ethiopia, who are there to see what's happening, and not just, so a lot of those news platforms, news media basically got a lot of their information from Facebook posts, right? They took Facebook posts, it was unverified, they disseminated as facts, and it wasn't verified. And then a lot of people took those articles basically as evidence of what was happening in Ethiopia. So it's a complete mess at the moment, but yet there's very little that's been done about it. So we basically created the lab to really bring together a safe space, to bring together representatives from academia, from the private sector, from civil society, that we see a lot of, for example, these industries who are very concerned about how is it that we increase our engagement with civil society, right? We're not able to include them in the policy development and the design of our products, but how is it that we're able to, we can create that bridge between civil society and what we're doing in Silicon Valley. And like I said earlier, the main thing is include them in the design of the products and the policies, but yet we're not doing this. Like, we're never ready to do this. So it's really important that we think about decentralizing. It's really important that, as we see, especially with the pandemic, as we realize even more that everything that we do is global, is interconnected, that we are able to decentralize and really level up that knowledge sharing and production. So it includes the perspective and realities of people around the world. And just last but not least, like a lot of things that are happening in Brazil, for example, at the moment, I'm very worried. I'm not Brazilian myself, but I've been working in Brazil for a very long time. And I'm very worried about what's happening, because unless we're really addressing those misinformative journalistic practices, but also kind of intervening in what these holding these platforms accountable to what is happening in other countries other than the US and Europe, we're going to create more and more conflict. I mean, I'm just really worried that something is going to happen next year in Brazil unless something is done. So it's and then there's a lot of news that came out, open news, that a lot of these platforms are basically lobbying heavily against a hate speech law that's trying to pass, basically to keep those platforms accountable in Brazil. A lot of this news doesn't really leave Brazil, so that's why this knowledge sharing is key. And with that, I'll leave the floor to my colleagues to do a deeper dive into the issues that we're trying to address today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next, I'd like to bring in Rebekah Trumbull, who is an associate professor at the School of Media and Public Affairs and the director of the Institute for Data, Democracy, and Politics at George Washington University. So Rebekah's research focuses on political communication, digital research methodology, and research ethics. And she's particularly interested in political discourse on social media, as well as the spread and impact of online misinformation. Rebekah, I'll leave it to you for the introduction.
Thank you so much, Jane. And let me echo the earlier gratitude for including me in this esteemed panel. I've been thinking about these issues of how we improve online safety, the health of online environments for a really long time, from a number of different angles. But today I'm going to focus on a particular project that has just recently gotten off the ground that sort of brings together, I think, a lot of the issues that I've been thinking about under one umbrella. The project we're calling Expert Voices Together. It's supported by Phase 1 Convergence Accelerator grant from the NSF. And so we're working on building a prototype that will help assist members of expert communities who are facing coordinated campaigns of online harassment. And really the perspective begins from the notion that, the need for this tool, the urgency of the work is so great because trust in our information ecosystems is at an all-time low. And yet the very experts who are best equipped to counter misperceptions, to ultimately increase trust in information that's available, they themselves become the targets of abuse and distortion. They're facing violent threats, vicious smears, demeaning attacks. Ultimately, the experts are placing themselves at truly incredible risk. And research shows that these risks are particularly severe for female journalists. Unfortunately, we find that experts facing these attacks tend to receive little support, whether that's from bystanders, their employers, or of course, the online platforms themselves. In fact, the reporting systems that have been set up by the platforms tend to further traumatize victims, forcing them to comb through really all of the heinous content to report posts one by one. And so as a result, we know that many experts go silent, whether we're talking about journalists, scientists, public health officials, election officials, they're moving their voices offline. Some of them are even walking away from their jobs altogether. So, ultimately, this leaves the trolls to claim victory and perpetuate the culture of abuse, with ultimately devastating consequences for already low levels of trust in the information ecosystems. The team that we put together to work on this project is bringing together specialists from academia, from different disciplines in academia, from media and civil society, all of whom have been working on these issues for years. In fact, most of the members of our teams have not only witnessed, but indeed experienced the impacts of online harassment firsthand. And so bring a sort of both intellectual, but also personal passion and commitment to making the spaces safer for everyone, but particularly for vulnerable experts. And so with Expert Voices Together, we're working on building a secure technical system that incorporates features for rapid intake by trained supporters. You can think of a kind of crisis hotline model, as well as rapid response to and monitoring of ongoing threats. And so we hope that this monitoring in particular will allow us to collect a really rich set of data on the sources and flows of these attacks, so that we can ultimately feed that back into a better understanding of where they're coming from and think about platform design itself. At the same time, we're developing public service campaign materials that will help experts better understand how to protect themselves, but really crucially help public bystanders know the best ways that they can intervene to support without actually re-traumatizing those who are experiencing harassment. And then crucially, one of the things that I really want to underline that I think is essential in all of this work is that we shift our thinking about solutions to online harms, that we shift our thinking about the ways to make online spaces safer and healthier from the type of work that focuses on placing the onus on the individuals themselves. Even when we're talking about things like how do we reconfigure the platform's reporting systems, so often the impetus, the solutions that are come up with, that we come up with, the sort of technical solutions that we come up with actually are just about making it easier for the individual, right, to respond to things. Ultimately, I believe, our team believes, that we have to shift that responsibility to institutions. So this means, on the one hand, that we shift the responsibility to the organizations that employ these experts, right? The experts who are facing these campaigns, who are putting themselves through trauma, who are facing threats, are ultimately doing so in service of, right, their larger employer and their careers and so on. And so we need employers to step up and take financial and well beyond financial responsibility for supporting those who are facing these threats. But then, of course, we also need the platforms to step up and take responsibility. And so this is where our project, is really, really trying to build, at the same time that we're focused on figuring out the ways that we can use best practices from trauma-informed care to provide direct support, community-based support to those who are facing the harassment. We also are working to collect as much information as possible to feed back into the heart of platform design questions. And so, going back to some of the things that Niousha was raising at the very beginning about how important it is to have those who are affected be part of, have a voice in the design itself, we think that that is absolutely essential. And we want the platforms to be talking to and thinking through what these harms look like, right? Be talking to the people who are experiencing the harms, and not just, right, sort of nameless, faceless experts who have some sense of what, oh, this is a, an interesting technical feature from an engineering perspective. So that's, in a nutshell, the heart of the work that we're doing. We feel, a profound commitment to doing this well, to doing it right, and yet at the same time, an incredible, the weight of this incredible responsibility.
Thank you for that, Rebekah. To continue the discussion, I'm going to bring in Joshua Tucker, who's a professor of politics at New York University and one of the co-founders and co-directors of NYU's Center for Social Media and Politics. His research has examined topics such as partisan echo chambers, online hate speech, the effects of exposure to social media on political knowledge, online networks and protest, disinformation and fake news, how authoritarian regimes respond to online opposition, and of course, Russian bots and trolls. Joshua, I'll kick it over to you.
Thank you so much, Jane. And I want to thank Niousha and Rebekah already. This has already been incredibly informative. It's an incredible pleasure and honor to be a part of it. The stuff you're talking about is so unbelievably interesting. I'm going to take us in a slightly different direction, which was asked to talk about research that we've been doing at the Center for Social Media and Politics on ways to test reducing harms online. And we've been thinking about this in terms of sort of three general areas where we've been doing research, and this is just where our research interests have laid recently. The first is thinking about the harm of people's exposure to false information. So thinking about ways to improve people's ability to discern the veracity of news. The second, also on disinformation, is thinking about interventions that could improve people's exposure to low quality news or people's reliance on low quality news when they're online. And the third, which is more closely tied to what Rebekah was just talking about, is ways to reduce the use of harmful speech online. And I'm going to share some results on all three of these. But what I want to start with is an overall plea that whenever we're thinking about, after all the super important work that Rebekah's talking about and Niousha's talking about how do you get inputs on this, how do you get design things? So that's like one end of it, like where are the ideas coming from that are about the theme of this panel, reducing online harms. But on the implementation side, the plea is that like when we go to implement measures that are designed to reduce online harms, that they get tested first with rigorous analyses of impact before we go forward and roll them out on platforms that, as was said, affect billions of people. Because the stakes are so high given the scale of social media and given the ability of things to go viral, and including, you know, interventions to go viral. And interventions can have unanticipated effects, especially when we think that these are interventions that are happening in kind of very complex networks with lots of different things going on. So to begin with the subject of unanticipated effects, let me begin by talking about some work we've done on people's ability to identify the veracity of news they encounter online. And we've run a lot of these tests, and I'm happy to talk more about them during Q&A, but the one I'm going to talk about today is almost the simplest suggestion you can imagine saying to someone. You know, somebody says, hey, I read this thing online and it said something that's, you know, totally nuts, right? And you're like, well, did you look to check if there was any sort of corroborating evidence to support that, you know, thing that you've read that seems crazy to me, right? So it seems like the simplest advice. This is what we would tell our kids. Don't just believe it. See if you can find corroborating evidence. So this seems like it would make a lot of sense. However, as part of a larger study, when we were testing all sorts of things having to do with people's ability to identify the veracity of news and testing a number of different interventions in this regard, we set up a randomized control trial to test whether or not actually searching for additional information online made people better at discerning whether false news was indeed correctly false. And the ways we did this is we asked people to assess veracity of some news stories, and some of them were randomly assigned to search for information, and some of them were not assigned to search for information. So this was what's called a between subjects test, where we had people with the same story, some searching, some not. And we also ran a series of within subject experiments where we asked people to assess whether a news story was true. Then we had them go out and search for information, and then we gave them a chance to change their answer if they wanted after they had searched for information. And we did this with news that had appeared in the past 24 hours. So news stories that had just appeared online, which is when most people encounter news, and before we have the world of fact checks and PolitiFact and all these folks to weigh in on things. This was part of a much larger project that had to do with crowdsourcing fake news. And some of you will know we just published a paper on the crowdsourcing part of it in the new Journal of Online Trust and Safety, speaking, you know, very near and dear to the stuff we're talking about here today, out of Stanford as well. So huge heads up for that new journal, but we just published the results from that. But just to say a tiny word about the pipeline we set up, as part of this larger project, we were collecting articles daily, and we ran this from December of 1919 into November of 1919 into January of 2020, which, if you remember, was a kind of interesting time in the world. So we actually reran it again after COVID hit in May and June of 2020, and ran a separate study looking at just sort of COVID related information. And what we did was we sent out, we had these streams of articles. And we had 5 different streams of articles, 3 streams of which were from low quality news sources. And they were sort of left leaning, right leaning, and couldn't tell. And every day we'd take the most popular news story that had appeared in the past 24 hours, and we'd send it out to 90 ordinary citizens, but also 6 professional fact checkers. And we use the professional fact checkers as our sort of ground truth. All right, our findings, which came back, were first that on average, searching made people more likely to believe true news when the news was true, that more likely to believe that true news was true. But, and here's the unanticipated consequence, they also became more likely to believe that false news was true. And this held for COVID-related information as well. This was a surprising, unanticipated finding, not what we had pre-registered as our expectation for what was going to happen. And so we reran another study on this where we actually hooked people up to, people allowed us to track their browsing behavior. So we had captured their browsing data. And what we found was that our findings were being driven by searches when they returned low quality news, and by respondents who were in the lower half of digital literacy. So both of those conditions had to hold. For people who were in higher digital literacy searching for information, that didn't make them more likely to believe false news was true. And for people even in lower levels of digital information, if you had high quality news came back. But if you had both of those hold, then you became more likely to believe in false information. So for evaluating interventions, this is suggesting potential value of digital literacy training, but it also raises the potential dangers of telling people to just go search for information. It's not a really good public campaign to say, go search for information if you know what you're talking about, right? Like that's not a real thing that's going to work. This plays a big role of Dana Boyd's concept of data voids, of when you go search for information that mainstream media is not talking about, you may encounter, because of the information ecosystem that arises around false news, you may just encounter more of that false news. But also it reminds us of QAnon's motto, which was educate yourself, right? That takes on a new and kind of eerier function when you start thinking about these results. All right, so to follow up with reliance on low quality news, if the quality of news sites returned by search is a problem, what if we just tell people about their quality? So in another study, we did a randomized control trial with browsing data, where we assigned half of our respondents to just browse normally, and half of our respondents had something called NewsGuard installed, which gave a little green symbol before any hyperlink that went to a trustworthy news source, and a little red symbol before something that went to a non-trustworthy source. And we tracked these people for a couple of weeks to see if people would consume, on average, higher quality news if they were getting this feedback about what was higher quality and low quality. Much to our disappointment, on average, this had zero effect, which was really, again, not what we were expecting. However, we did find that among people who before the study were our highest consumers, the top 2 deciles of low quality news, for this population, actually visit to low quality news sites did seem to go down. Now, we hadn't pre-registered and we didn't have enough power to do this definitively, but the findings are suggestive that actually for target populations, this may actually have been something that was helpful. And so more research needs to be done in that regard. Finally, very quickly, to just talk about harmful speech here, we ran a study where we were motivated by the question of what do you do about people using hateful speech on platforms? Right? One option is you can kick them off the platforms, but then they might go to other platforms. And some of those people might go to other platforms that are more radicalizing. And you might inadvertently be kicking people who are maybe low-level users into areas where they're going to get radicalized and put into sort of more intense communities in this regard. So we were asking, was there something we could do short of kicking people off platforms that might reduce their use of hate speech? So this is a piece we just recently published in Perspectives on Politics. And we built up, and this was under a PhD student in the lab, Rebekah, built up this amazing kind of innovative pipeline to find people who had followed someone who had gotten kicked off the platform after using hate speech and was using hate speech themselves. And we ran a randomized control trial where we targeted these folks and we sent them a variety of different theoretically informed warnings that they too might get kicked off the platform for using hate speech. And as some journalists have picked up on, our warnings, this wasn't what we were sort of focusing on, but they were fairly polite. That was the thing that journalists seem to find most interesting about the warnings. And 1 week out, we did find from just a single email, a 10 to 15% drop in hate speech usage. It dissipated within 4 weeks, but this was only from one tweet. And this was only from one tweet from essentially accounts with low followers. And so this is also, I wanted to end on a good note. This is sort of encouraging about something that might work. Now, there's a lot more research we would have to do. How this would be played out if it was done at scale, if it was coming from Twitter as opposed to our accounts, is a whole other thing that I'm happy to talk about in question and answer. But in closing, I just want to say, sort of my big picture takeaway from this is we really want to think about testing rigorously interventions before we implement them. This has to be a part of the pipeline. And if Niousha and Rebekah are talking about the beginning of how we generate ideas, this has to be a part of the lower end before we implement these things and before we put our weight and our impetus and our endorsement behind implementing them. The last thing I also want to mention is it takes a village to do this kind of research. So I mentioned Rebekah, who's a PhD student at CSMAP. Our prior students, Kevin Munger and Alexandra Siegel, helped pioneer this method of going out and using these sock puppet accounts. And then Kevin Aslett, who is a PhD student who's on the job market, was in lead author on the NewsGuard study working with Andy Guess and other people in the lab, and also has been the lead on our veracity of news studies. So thanks to all the hard work that's been put in by lots of people at the Center for Social Media and Politics for me to be able to bring you these results here today. So looking forward to continuing the discussion, and thanks so much again to everyone else for joining today.
And last but not least, I'd like to introduce Sahar Massachi, who is the co-founder and executive director of the Integrity Institute, which is a new nonprofit bringing together current and former social media integrity professionals to help build better social media content. During a 4-year stint at Facebook, a company I don't know if anybody here has heard of, he worked on the civic integrity team, which protected elections and deepened civic engagement worldwide. Sahar is also an affiliate at the Berkman Klein Center for the Internet Society at Harvard University. And the floor is yours.
Thank you. Wow, thank you. Hi, everyone. What a cool group I'm in. Thank you for having me. I'm now on the clock. Okay, so we have a lot of information to go over. We don't have much time. Please pay attention. First, who am I? I have a slideshow I'm not sharing with you, but they are keeping me on focused on what I'm going to say. So in the past, I worked at Wikipedia, computers, social good. How do you do all of them at the same time? So I took a try at working at Facebook, and I worked there from 2016 to 2019, and learned a lot. Right now I live in Boston, Somerville, but soon my partner and I are moving to New York, and we're looking for new friends. So hit me up if you're in Boston or in New York. A little bit about what the Integrity Institute is. So we are growing a community of tech workers with experience working at social media companies on problems that lie at the intersection of tech, policy, and society. We'll talk more about that later. We believe in a social internet that helps societies, democracies, and individuals thrive, and we do that through 3 things. Our first and biggest project is finding integrity workers and building a community. Integrity workers are people like me whose job was at platforms fixing all the problems. Turns out there is a whole new field of fixing problems on social platforms. It's pretty cool. We're going to talk about that. Number 2, taking this community and enriching, building, disseminating, nurturing the shared knowledge inside the community. And lastly, sharing this knowledge to the world. So that's us. Enough of that. Now I'm just going to talk about how I think about integrity work and what this all is. Everyone ahead of me said cool things. And just quickly, I think that the 3 big ideas that really grabbed me were it's international, content moderation or the onus on individuals is kind of a dead end, and test things. And you'll see that reflected when I'm about to talk about. So we have this giant complex system, and we're trying to figure out as a society how to understand it before even trying to fix it. How do we do that? People at the companies have to do it. How do they do it? They do it basically by tweaking knobs, running tests, and looking at the results. And the results are shown as a form of A/B testing metrics. So you just try a thing and see how the metrics change. So you don't have to understand the intricacies of TikTok's feed ranking algorithm or Twitter's feed ranking algorithm. You just, change a value, run a test, see, did it make hate speech go up? Did it make it go down? Did it make engagement go up or down? That kind of thing. And that actually works. That's how companies do it. And a thing that gives you really quickly is this understanding that these A/B testing metrics, the thing that people look at when they try to change a system, are the skeleton key to understanding the entire system, because that is the thing that they're trying to optimize. So for a lot of things, they optimize engagement. It's like liking, retweeting, posting, sharing, that kind of thing. And you can think of not just the feed of a social platform, but in fact, the entire social platform as trying to optimize a few of these top company A/B testing metrics. I hope that makes sense. We're going to move on. So when you think about it, what's happening is almost like a gravity well, like, the old Einstein, like rubber sheet, rock, well, that's the system that is being built, and it's incentivizing things that lead to lots of engagement on the platform. And that means things that typically tend to be bad, because it's just one of those things that have lots of engagement tend to be bad. And a lot of the fixes that you hear about are kind of about like putting little barriers or little like barricades near the top of this gravity well to stop people from falling in. But they'll just find a way around them because the potential energy is still there. So this has some organizational implications too. The job of an integrity team is to say something like, hey, everyone's trying to squeeze the most engagement or whatever it is out of the system, maybe we should try and optimize for something else a little bit. And I don't know if you're familiar with the term hill climbing, like the whole company is hill climbing towards a local optima of a metric, and integrity teams say, well, maybe we should like move off the top of the hill. This creates really strong incentives for everyone else at the company to try and jump back on the hill. And so what they won't do necessarily is just revert your changes, but what they can do is just like keep changing the knobs until they, by accident, come up with a configuration that undoes what you do as a team. This gets to understanding the organizational dynamics inside these companies, and organizational behavior, I think, is the real question here. So that's the big reason I think that change doesn't happen, but there's a few others. One is, you could say, like the lobbyists or the policy teams at companies, right? Like, we can't do this change because Tucker Carlson will be mad. We can't do this change because it will complicate our relationships with the government of India, that kind of stuff. And that's really real. We can talk more about that later. So in terms of how to fix this, I think the big fix is organizational. These companies are machines for optimizing a metric. And if you get them to adopt a better metric as a whole company, they'll optimize it. If you had really high quality integrity metrics that every department in the company had to move up, then they would move them up. And what we're seeing is not that level of excitement at many companies, because integrity is at odds with growth and some other things. So my job as an integrity person was not necessarily to think about, highfalutin theories about why the company wasn't letting me do what I wanted. My job was to do actual fixes and like think about, implicitly, like, what's the most positive change we can make that doesn't piss off demagogic media figures or make our engagement metrics go down. And I think that in venues like this, people want me to give those examples. And I tend to say, well, let's talk about like why I wasn't allowed to do it in the first place. But just to whet your appetite a little bit, a way to think about a social media platform, I think for me, is this is a city of atomic supermen. People are flying, they're teleporting, they're cloning themselves. We live in a world where, you can create a robot army of fake accounts and no one can tell the difference without close examination. How do you police a city like that? It's really hard. And content moderators, the sort of policemen, like, it's hard for them to police this infinite city of like billions of people with human scale tools. And so I think the first thing that someone needs to do is just change the rules of gravity a little bit. Maybe you shouldn't be able to have many fake accounts. Maybe make it harder. Maybe someone who shows up to the platform doesn't have the same kind of access to features that someone who's like built trust over years has, right? Maybe you shouldn't be able to, I don't know, post in 100 groups an hour until you've matured your account in some way, stuff like that. But those are some ideas, and there's a lot more. And people like me, integrity workers, have tons of ideas, many that we've tried and tested, and many that we weren't allowed to test or didn't have the time or budget to. And so the question is, like, how does society interact with this? Because what you don't want to see necessarily is a congressman, grilling, I don't know, Adam Mosseri and saying, will you right now promise to implement my pet design idea? That's really bad. Speaking personally, I think it would be very cool if we created metrics for how these companies are doing on these kinds of problems, using data that they divulge to the public and say, like, I don't know, Reddit, your integrity metrics are doing really good this quarter, great work. Or like, I don't know, TikTok, your integrity metrics are ticking upwards and we wanted to see a 50% reduction year over year, like you're in the doghouse. Like, if companies are really good at optimizing for metrics, we need to get them to like optimize for better metrics. I have 40 seconds. I have a lot of other things to say, but I guess to close up, there is a profession of trying to make things better that thinks about stuff like this at companies. They're called integrity workers. They're wonderful. And we should think about how to support them and how to like understand this, because I think it is a new kind of knowledge and a new kind of work that we're just starting to see. And at the Integrity Institute, we're excited to find these people, support them, build a community, and be a bridge from integrity workers to the rest of the world, which is what I'm doing now. Thanks for having me. Thanks, audience. Bye.
Thank you, everybody. And wow, what a vast field we covered in the first portion of the panel. I'll just remind everybody that if you have questions for our panelists, there's already some trickling in, but as we hold this conversation, if you have questions, just use the Q&A feature and I will sift through them and pose them to our panelists. So one thing I'd like to get to before I get to the audience question is the question at the heart of this panel. Because we know a lot about the problems that we've outlined here. We've studied them for many years. We've seen them on the ground. We've encountered them personally in many cases. And when we have conversations like this one, it's really important that we don't start from scratch. We don't start from zero. And instead incorporate the knowledge that we've already outlined. So to that end, I want to note that we know a lot of the symptoms of this problem. We know that harmful online misinformation or even hate can be financially profitable. It can be politically profitable. And we also know that as much as we talk about automated accounts or anonymous accounts, much of this is public and done under real names for political purposes we can track. So perhaps the question that I'll pose is looking at the solutions and harm reduction strategies that we've done in the past. Are there ones that were effective or maybe even complete failures that we can take from and learn going forward? Some of this we've already covered, but I'm thinking about projects like Crosscheck, Africa Checked, and the Election Integrity Partnership, where we've seen crisis response when we know that there will be a crisis. And maybe Niousha, I'll start with you and we'll go from there.
Thank you very much, Jane. So as you were thinking, I was thinking about the most recent ones, but for example, I'm thinking about, think about comparing, for example, the identifying harmful speech online around the world, right? So really depends on the region and really depends on the presence of the platform in that country or in that region. So for example, in Latin America, it's been for certain countries, all the countries except for, I would say, Brazil, it's been much easier for them to have a conversation and dialogue with the platforms. And the platforms have been much more ready, but also very fast in the response, right? So evaluating the harmful content and making sure that the content is taken down, and especially particularly when it comes to harm that's been or harassment towards activists and journalists. So I see that as a success in that part of the world. So it's not always negative. I would say that in the case of Brazil, it's much more complex. Maybe it has to do with the institution as well, the governmental institution, but it's been much slower for them, and they've been much more successful in basically contacting the platform's headquarters than over here. It has a lot to do with also who is contacting which platforms. So the usual suspects, for example, those are part of the trusted partners programs, are not the smaller organizations, have a much easier, like they're part of they took part in RightsCon or IGF, and they have a personal contact. So they have a much easier time to be able to address and kind of engage with the platforms. I would say that in the case of East Africa, it's been extremely, extremely difficult. And not until, I would say a couple of years ago, you had the policy development one person for all of Africa in London, not even on the African continent. And it wasn't until just recently that they, basically appointed somebody and put them in. So it really depends on the presence of the company in that region, but also when they hire somebody who is a local person and who has a local and contextualized understanding of the region. You see the same thing about, like, for example, the responses in Sri Lanka. They were able, but it was post-conflict and post-crisis that they finally, switched their methods and then hired somebody who was from Sri Lanka to respond a lot to respond to the issues, but also to evaluate the content online. So it's really that context is really important, and that inclusion of the expert from that part of the world who understands the language, who understands what is harmful in that language. For example, what is harmful in an Arabic that's used in Saudi Arabia is completely different than the Arabic that's used in Somalia, right? So you cannot just say, oh, we have Arabic now in our content moderation, then we're good. So it's that's really key, that contextualization, and maybe like a database or a data entry of different kind of depending on the context of content that's harmful in that region, that could be helpful. Like, I'm not saying we have all the answers, but sharing knowledge from the different stakeholders and thinking about, what has worked, like exactly to a question, what has worked in Paraguay that could be applied to maybe Sri Lanka, that could thought about in South Sudan or Myanmar could be helpful, but also in thinking about not getting to that crisis, right? So we had, for example, an early alert system where as soon as that content was, for example, Ethiopia, the content has been going on since 2020, but they've been reporting harmful contents in the early, like January, February of 2020, but yet it's been completely disregarded by Western news, media, but also the content platforms, and it's led to what it is right now, right? A complete mess of misinformation and complete misunderstanding of what the conflict is all about. So we saw the same thing about Myanmar. It took months for the platforms to respond to it. So I think that before we even get to the crisis, if there's an alert system that can help us to understand what's happening, and maybe an independent body that can help to evaluate this, would be extremely useful.
It's really striking that you say we need to get there before the crisis, because, of course, thinking back, however long we choose to think back, but almost always these problems are particularly acute during crises, and that's because of the data void concept that we've already brought up in this conversation. And I think one interesting thing that particularly Joshua said is that you can't just tell people to look for good information, because access to accurate, swift information is not equal globally. So it's not always the solution that we can turn to. And it's also a little bit discouraging that even when we're looking at solutions outside of tech companies, we need some amount of tech company buy-in, because they're platforms, and we are very limited in what we're able to do without social media companies' participation. So I want to take a question from the audience that I think dovetails really nicely, which is what are the ways that we can create better collaborative environments in the next year or so between academics and industry researchers and designers? And Rebekah, I know you've talked a little bit about this in your introduction, so maybe I'll throw this one to you to talk about your project and how we can extrapolate from it.
Yeah, I think that there are lots of opportunities. We're starting to see some of these things take fruition and be developed. And of course, I'm on the call here with Josh, who's co-leading all of the work on the Facebook Election 2020 research project, which I'm part of, which is a collaboration between Facebook and independent external researchers to really dig into important questions about Facebook's impact on the American elections in 2020. But there's so much more that we can do and we need to be creative about. And I think that I saw in the question in particular that Alex was asking in the Q&A section, right, that he was asking about a number of these things that could be really, really fruitful. I think the key to making this work, though, is that we need to think from the beginning about the mechanisms that we put in place for those sorts of discussions and collaborations to get out to the public. So the beauty of this Election 2020 project is that we're undertaking the research, it's pre-registered, we're committed, and we have a commitment from Facebook to publish everything that comes out of it. And that sort of thinking needs to be part of every single one of these collaborations from the beginning, because what we have in process now is a lot of academics, a lot of civil society experts, a lot of folks who effectively consult or have ongoing lines of conversation with researchers and others at the platforms. But ultimately, there isn't a lot of public learning from that. And that's ultimately what we need, not just because the information needs to get out to the public, but also because that becomes a mechanism for accountability. I'm constantly thinking about these things that we can build, but for me, that's the absolutely essential starting point. How do we make sure that these things get out to the public?
I'm seeing our other panelists nod along. Josh, do you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just, Rebekah talked a little bit about the project and what's going on. I mean, I think the sort of motivating impetus for this is that exactly as you noted, Jane, like we are always going to come up against limitations of what we can do on our own externally. Nate Persley and I, in our book on social media and democracy, which is a sort of last chapter, is all dedicated to this question of data access and how do we do research. We're sort of saying, we have a part of that where we say, look, there's like 3 options we have if we think understanding social media's impact on society is important, right? One is we work around the platforms, right, with scraping and APIs and whatever we can get our hands on, which is fraught with all these complications because eventually we're limited in what we can do, and we're sort of at the mercy of the platforms because, as my colleagues at NYU have discovered, right, like you go to do some sort of scraping and all of a sudden you've got threat of legal litigation and things like that, right? And so that leaves you kind of at the mercy of the platforms, or you spend years building up infrastructure to collect data using an API structure, and then that API structure changes overnight, and you've got to start from scratch and do that. So that's problematic. And then the second way is you work with the platforms. And that's, of course, is like, has all sorts of inherent concerns and and things that you worry about when you have to work with the platforms to get this kind of thing done. And then the third option is you work with government to try to get government to regulate access, which up until about 6 weeks ago seemed like, that was also trying to push the rock up the hill forever. But maybe there's a little bit of motion on that. But I think the point that I wanted to add on to what Rebekah said about why we think this is so important is that exactly as Sahar was saying, like there is a ton of research going on inside these platforms. And we are in a period of time right now where we're at risk of an incredible knowledge drain, where scientific innovation is being, the fruits of scientific innovation are being limited to people who work for these trillion-dollar companies. And the trillion-dollar companies can accrue the development of scientific knowledge. But exactly as Sahar said, like, they weren't allowed to talk about some of their findings, and they weren't allowed to conduct some research. So you have the platform being the gatekeeper on both sides, what research gets done and what the researchers are allowed to talk about afterwards. And occasionally we get great papers that come out of platform researchers. Some Twitter researchers just published super interesting platform thing about amplification of right versus left-wing politicians in Europe. But again, how do we know how many other papers they wrote that weren't allowed to get through to the publication process? And so that's why I think what Rebekah and I are doing here with this Facebook, with the 2020 US Facebook election research project, or whatever we're calling it, is why we're willing to do it, is because we think this is a kind of existential challenge. It's a really different approach for social science research, where you have these huge actors in society, and they're actors in a political economy sense, in the sense that they're big, powerful companies that can lobby for policy, but they're also, by dint of being platforms, they are where so much interaction around politics and so much social interaction is occurring today. And if we don't take efforts, even when they're risky, to try to make some of that knowledge get back into the public domain, we're going to be in this really kind of asymmetric information environment that I think is incredibly potentially costly for society. It leads to policy making that's being done blind without having the sort of requisite information about it beforehand. And you lead with the kind of things like Niousha was talking about, where we end up with, there's all this knowledge about one part of the world, and the other part of the world, there's nothing that we know about in these kinds of things. And so that's, I think, kind of the motivation here. That's why this is so important to try to do these things. And I'll just say, very briefly, Rebekah brought it up, we have in this project tried to be incredibly self-conscious about the guardrails that we put on it. And Rebekah brought up, I think what's most important is everything is pre-registered that we're doing. And we all, as an academic team, agreed that our red line was that we were not going to do the project if there was any pre-publication review by the company in terms of based on the results of the study. So there's legal and privacy reviews, but the companies, that was our red line for getting involved in the first place. And there are other things that we put in place too, like we're talking about results when they're peer reviewed. We as an academic team took no money. Rebekah mentioned people go to work for these companies as consultants. It's a very different world when you go in and work as a consultant and you're getting paid as a company. We took no money from the company. So we're trying to think about that. We're hopeful that the lessons we learned from this project will be things we can share with other people. But it's a long, arduous road to try to figure out these models you're talking about.
And Sahar, I'm going to bring you in here to address both some of what's said already, but also a recurring question in our Q&A box here, which is how can we build incentive structures for these companies that optimize not just for engagement, which you touched on, but on something more meaningful?
Cool. Thanks again for having me, and what a fun panel and what good questions. To just add to what Rebekah and Josh were saying quickly, I really believe in this project. My buddy Winter is on the Facebook side managing it, and he is a man of unimpeachable integrity and great skill. And you're so lucky to have a chance to work with him. I wish I was still working with him. Shout out to my boy. Also, to this question of like industry academic collaboration, I think the Institute, the Integrity Institute, is a really interesting model of like a fourth option, right? Talk to integrity workers who are doing the work, but with their citizen hats on, not with their company hats on. And one thing that we're trying to figure out internally is how does this work? And like, we have this amazing community of like really cool people who have these skills and have worked at platforms. Like, how do we talk to people like Josh and CSMAP? And how do we talk to people like Rebekah and just academics in general? We haven't quite figured it out. So if anyone has ideas, please let us know. And if anyone wants to work with us, please let us know. If anyone wants to give us money, please let us know. To the incentives question, the short answer is that in the 70s, mathematicians came up with answers to a lot of these questions. It's called information retrieval algorithms, and they exist. And PageRank is one of the most famous, if not the most famous, implementation of one of these algorithms. To some extent, this is a solved problem. You just have to ask the mathematicians who've researched this. I mean, I think part of it is just like, it could be as simple as, instead of having engagement metrics as your top company metric, make it in one engagement metric, one integrity metric, or a blended metric. We can talk more about it. We're running out of time, but that's my take.
Yeah, it's tricky to look at the different parts of this problem, right? So we've talked about how people on the outside can try to reframe how we're thinking about the problem. We're talking about how workers for these companies can generate research and reframe that part of the problem. And one thing that we haven't touched on is policy solutions from governments themselves, which always is the trickiest problem. And it's almost always the hardest. Whenever I asked about this, everybody kind of just like shrugs their shoulders and looks away a little. But that's because you don't necessarily want to be regulating speech, and you don't want to set a precedent that can be abused in the future. And at the same time, if we're talking about the US government in particular, lawmakers need to be aware that whatever policy solutions they come up with, they need to take into account the fact that it will have global ripple effects. So the policy solutions will not only be implemented in the US, but globally. So maybe in the last 5 minutes, I will ask the question of whether there are any policy solutions that seem particularly promising when we talk about this issue as a whole. And I'm not quite sure who to pose that to specifically, because I think, it's such a big overarching question. But Rebekah, can I single you out here?
Yeah, I'm happy to start on this, and in particular because I've been wrestling with this not just in the US context, but as I think many people here are aware, before I moved to GW and came here to DC, I spent 8 years at Leiden University in the Netherlands, and so really got to see firsthand the way that European policymakers have been thinking about this. And I've actually been doing a lot of work on the Digital Services Act and some other measures that they have in place. And I'll say that one of the things that I'm most hopeful about in the European policy landscape and the ways that it might have broader impacts, not just for the US, but globally, is thinking about policies that really focus on risk assessment and harm mitigation in response to risk assessment, but do so in a way that is broad thinking so that you can define the potential harms in a way that are flexible so that we're not wed to, say, our obsession at the end of 2020 is on disinformation and political polarization. But guess what? In 2022 and 2023, actually, there are going to be things that are cropping up that are much more important. And in fact, when we extend these questions to the international arena, we really should be thinking about vastly different things. So we need policy that thinks about risk assessment in broad-based terms and ultimately grounds those in core democratic values, that presses the platforms to do their own internal risk assessments and then publish those out, but crucially brings in outside expertise. So does things like provide data access, mandate data access for civil society researchers and academics in particular who have expertise in these areas and can highlight what the harms are, and just as Josh was suggesting earlier, begin testing out proposed mitigations for these things. So that's pretty broad strokes, but I think that's the general sense that we need to start with in order to begin tackling these things from a policy perspective.
We've got about 4 minutes left here. So unfortunately, we're coming to the end of this discussion, but Sahar, I'm gonna bring you in for the last couple of minutes and then throw it back to Ziv.
Cool. So I think part of this is like a thing I try and have as a mantra is there's nothing new under the sun, really, right? Like what we're talking about are more or less consumer products that, are harmful to society. And when you talk about fixing them, people say, well, doesn't this create a race to the bottom? And like, what if the people who like do the right thing are outcompeted by people who do the wrong thing? And the answer is like, we dealt with that with lead in children's toys, right? We've dealt with this with all kinds of industries. Like society can regulate consumer products fine. And when it comes to arguments about speech, it's another thing that gets me a little antsy sometimes because, what we're talking about is behavior. Like spam is a behavior. Making fake accounts is a behavior. Even harassment is a behavior. And companies right now are absolutely regulating behavior. Like, are you allowed to post on Mark Zuckerberg's wall? No, because they made that choice, that design choice. Are you allowed to spam Ray-Bans on Facebook? No, because they made that anti-spam choice. So it's completely possible. And I think from a very broad view, all we need to do, one thing we can do is get a really good map of how these companies work and how this sort of system works. Find a way to quantify and understand what harm they're causing to society. And once we have those, we have an array of tried and true policy options for how you deal with pollution, how you deal with antisocial behavior. And we can just deploy them. That's my optimistic take.
Well, it's always nice to end on an optimistic take. From the outset, we said that this would be a complicated conversation because it's a complicated problem. But I do think that we've covered a lot of really interesting ground here. So thank you to the panelists, and thank you to our audience as well for their smart and informed questions. Zeev, I'll leave it to you to close us out. I think we're just about 2 minutes away from our hard stop.
Yeah, I just wanted, before we close, to say a few quick thanks. First to you, Jane, for your incredible moderation. It was that sort of moderation where really you were just a panelist who happened to be asking more questions than the other panelists. I wanted to thank our panelists for bringing their really incredible sort of and diverse experiences and expertise, and then sharing their time with us today, to the audience for coming, and then of course to Eric and Tasha on our team, who actually made this panel happen. So thank you so much. Again, feel free to reach out, and I hope everybody has a wonderful and restful end of December.
Thank you,
Bye, everybody.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Jane.